Welcome back to the channel, guys. If you're new here, I'm currently solo developing a PS1-Style multiplayer horror called Thalassomania, where the ocean essentially becomes your worst fucking nightmare. If you haven't checked out the first devlog, make sure to give that a watch before this one. Massive thank you to everyone who watched the first one and wishlisted Thalassomania on Steam. We've recently surpassed 100 wishlists in under a week, which really motivates me to continue this series, just adds that extra bit of fuel to the fire in getting this game complete. We have a slight problem with the game right now, in that there isn't an awful lot to do as a player. So to kick off this week's devlog, we need to establish what us nerds like to call the core game loop. So I decided to test if ChatGPT was on my level of creative thinking. I can confirm, it's shit. I came up with these ideas myself. The core game loop should consist of balancing two major goals. Number 1, preserving your anal virginity. Optional. Number 2, being a pirate, making it home alive, controlling the ship, having a good time. Some great ideas that ChatGPT definitely didn't help me with include being able to distract the creature by using decoy players, traps, and eventually even cooler things like sound distractions, which can be made by combining, say, like a can and some nails, and you can just throw that to distract the creature. All these would require crafting be added to Thalassomania, so that's exactly what we're going to be working on. For the crafting UI, I didn't want to do what a lot of games do and just have a boring little 2D UI. That'd be too easy. So here's my genius idea. The players will have to gather up their ingredients by either picking them up or dragging them close to each other, basically just making them into a pile, and then the recipes for those ingredients will be shown on screen, allowing you to select which one you want to craft based on those ingredients, or if you don't have any ingredients, they'll be highlighted in red. To do this, we're going to need to store some data, specifically recipes. For the recipes, we need to store the name of the recipe, a list of ingredients needed to craft said recipe, an image to display said recipe, and the time needed to craft, for you guessed it, said recipe. Then for the ingredients, we store a unique ID, a name, and an image for the UI also. So I put my Blender skills back into work and began modeling the ingredients, making sure to make them low poly and use shitty low res textures to stay true to that PS1 aesthetic that we all love. A really useful tip for all you devs trying to create this PS1 aesthetic is to make sure you set the filter mode to point when importing into Unity. This gives it that lovely crunchy aesthetic. Now it's all good making these models, but how do we actually craft? First, we need a way to store that data I just went over. Best way to do this in Unity is to use something called scriptable objects. These are really cool in that they allow you to store a bunch of similar data and keep that data the same wherever you use them. So you haven't got to update it in a million places, you can just edit in one place and it'll update everywhere. Fucking amazing. You have to make them in code by adding this part to the top of the script. Now I want to take the time to thank a very special person, myself, for remembering to use polymorphism when creating the physics system a few months back. Which to all you non-nerds, people who have lost their virginity, basically means you make something as generic as possible when coding, so that later on, if you ever need a certain bit of functionality, like right now we need the dragging functionality, all we have to do to make these crafting items draggable is inherit from the draggable class, which we created months back when we did the physics system. So yeah, shout out Mr. Miles, my computer science teacher, for teaching me all about that. We still have one issue. Poor Billy is still yearning to craft. How can we do that? Let me break it down for you. No, I don't mean channeling my inner Pop Smoke. We will contain all the crafting logic within a new player script, creatively called player crafting. We first need to store what's known as a layer mask. This basically allows us to only scan for crafting ingredients, because you can imagine we don't care if we're looking at a player, we only care if we're looking at a crafting ingredient for this particular script. We also then store a max distance, so we don't end up scanning ingredients through walls, etc. We then store a list of available ingredients, which are updated every fraction of a second, depending on what ingredients we're looking at. Then based on the ingredients we are looking at, we then store a list of the available recipes, even including the ones we don't have all the ingredients for, just so the players are aware, a bit like Terraria. It will show you if you've got parts of the ingredients. And then finally, we'll create a bunch of events that other scripts, like the crafting UI script, can then hook into. Say if we were to change the selected recipe, or the list of available ingredients changed, the list of available recipes changed, we can hook into those events and update the UI accordingly. Here are some other variables I didn't mention that we will also need. I know it looks complicated, but it isn't actually that bad. We first make sure the script is only running on the local player, which is just standard networking practice. It makes no sense running this code on another client because it's not relevant. We then use the camera to get the direction the players are looking, then use this handy function called physics.spherecastAll, which will basically do exactly as I drew earlier on. This takes in our direction, radius, max distance, and layer mask that I mentioned earlier. This method returns a list of colliders, which in our case are the ingredients. We then filter by selecting only the ingredients that we can craft with. As imagine another player is already crafting other players shouldn't be able to use those ingredients as it could create duplicates, which this method does for us quite handily just by checking if someone's already using it, and then whenever we start crafting, we'll update those ingredients to say, yeah, we're using it, so other players can't use it. We then update list of recipes based on any changes to the list of ingredients that we're looking at. And then we update the selected ID if need be. So say you were looking at nothing and you were looking at some ingredients. The selected ID needs to change from -1 to whatever the first ingredient ID is that you're looking at. We then also make sure to only call the event every half second or so to avoid making constant, expensive calls to the server. Then if we aren't looking at any ingredients, we simply just set the selected recipe ID to -1, and that will automatically hide the UI because it will hook into that event later on. We then check to see if the player has pressed tab. This is the key that they'll use to change the selected ID of the recipes. We also then check to see if the player attempts to craft, which is simply just by pressing and holding E. And if they have, we begin crafting. Don't worry if this all went over your head, I'll give you a second to recover from all that nerd talk. Now onto the UI. The UI consists of 3 main parts. We've got the list of available recipes at the top, the list of ingredients at the bottom, and the progress bar right in the middle. You might be asking, how do we make a crafting UI? Well, in Unity, I think the best way to do this is to use what's called a grid layout for the list of recipes and ingredients, which allows you to do really cool shit like this, simply just by adding and removing game objects under them, which keeps them centered automatically, which is very, very handy. Each little item under these grids are instances of a new class I created called the UI crafting slot, which stores an image, obviously of the recipe or ingredient, a red image, which will be enabled or disabled based on whether or not you can craft that recipe, description or name of the ingredient, and finally a selected image to show the player which recipe they've currently got selected. For the code side of the UI, we simply just need to inject the player crafting script we just wrote on the onStart local player event. This allows us to set up the UI as soon as the player joins the game. We then subscribe to those events we previously just wrote in the player crafting script. That will then update the UI accordingly. So if they were holding E and they can craft, we then show that progress bar, or if they press tab, we'll change the selected index for that recipe. Then in the update loop, we check to see if a recipe has been selected. If we do, we simply show the description of the recipe in between those 2 grids before they've pressed E yet, just so they got a better idea of what the item is they're about to craft. And just like that, Billy can finally craft. Let's go. We can now make a fake player, which clearly works fucking amazingly. I also added a little VFX when the recipe is crafted, which I did using Unity's particle system, if you know, you know. What next? I then wanted to start working on some of the navigation minigames, which would essentially be how the player progresses in terms of making it home alive. The first idea, again, that I definitely came up with, is a map of the ocean. The minigame would essentially work by briefly showing you a dozen or so obstacles. You've got a couple seconds to remember where exactly they are, and then you have a couple seconds to then plot the course of the ship, doing your best guess to remember where those obstacles were. So open up Photoshop, began working on the little UI overlay for this. This minigame could be made a lot more difficult as the game progresses, by giving less and less time to remember the obstacles, or even just simply adding more obstacles. The idea is this minigame would be used to plot a course of the ship for a length of time, say like 5 minutes. This is so that a player doesn't have to always be steering the ship and can actually do other things and explore. The player will likely have to alter the course manually if they plotted the course incorrectly, which they can do so by steering it. They'll be notified of potential upcoming collisions through the radar system, which I also worked on this week, so stay tuned for that. That one's quite interesting. I want to develop this further in the future, adding a ship-wide alarm/alert system so the players can be notified without actually having to be in the helm of the ship. And here's a little mock-up of it in-game. The actual minigame still needs coding, but that's a job for the next devlog. I then worked on the blueprints UI screen. This will be used to show where leaks and general repair is needed on the ship, as it's likely the ship will collide with some obstacles during the course of the game. It's up to you to detect and repair those issues to make it home alive and not bloody sink. I then wanted to spice up the engine's UI, as currently it's looking a bit shit. And you guessed it, we start designing it in Photoshop. The purpose of this engine UI is to diagnose problems as the creature tampers with it. There's a bunch of warning lights for low fuel, checking the engine, etc, just like a bloody car. You'll also be able to change the speed of the ship using the throttle in relation to these obstacles, and it's up to you to decide if the course of the ship needs changing, which you can do with the steering wheel. You have to communicate with whoever's controlling the ship over the scuffed in-game radio. Handy tip for making pixelated UIs like this in Photoshop is to mainly use smart objects. That way you can apply a mosaic filter to them without losing any of the details. You can just go into the smart object and enter it in full quality. And yeah, here's a finished mock-up. Again, all the meters and that still need to be coded, but you get the picture, and we'll definitely do that for the next devlog. Another helpful tip for you devs out there, make sure you install this 2D PSD import package. This essentially allows you to copy the layer structure of Photoshop. That way you haven't got to constantly be saving and updating images. You can just use the PSB file inside Photoshop and only update the layers if need be. Next up is the radar. This was a fun one to make. The idea for the radar is whenever objects are within a certain range, it's obviously going to make a beeping sound, encouraging you to then interact with the radar. Now the radar I actually did program logic for. I didn't just make the UI like I did for the others. So the way this works is we shoot out ray casts constantly at different angles from the center of the ship. Like imagine it spiraling. We use the same method that we did for the crafting, so we've got a new layer mask, which only cares about ocean obstacles. If an object is hit within our max distance, say 250 meters or so, we will then show that as a blip on the radar. Else if an obstacle is out of range, we don't need to show it. It won't make a blip, it won't make a sound. Code for this simply stores a bunch of unique collisions. It's important that they are unique because multiple rays could hit the same object and you wouldn't want multiple blips for that same obstacle. Then every frame it will update the rotation of that green scan line that you see on a radar. We then use this fancy math function, which I have no clue really how it works, to detect when it's completed a half rotation. And every half rotation we clear the list of colliders, since there's no chance of another ray hitting that same collider. We then cast the ray cast based on the rotation of the scan line and the rotation of the ship. Then we check to see if an obstacle we've just hit isn't already in the list. If it's already in the list, we don't care about it. We get the position of it relative to the ship and almost just scale that down to the UI since they're both following the same rotation. We then instantiate a UI blip and play a sound, as you can see here. That's pretty much it for this week's devlog. I've had a lot of feedback saying people think this game might be a little too dark. Might be something I work on in the next devlog. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I've also got an exciting new creature model in the works, as the current one is very basic. This one's going to be a lot more oceanic. That's the only hint I'm giving, so stay tuned for that. Remember to wishlist Thalassomania on Steam, as it helps out massively. Let me know what you guys want to see me add to the game next. Any ideas, put them in the comments below. Anything you think I could have gone into more detail on, please let me know. Also, I'm always looking for constructive feedback. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.